In 1975, Michel Foucault published Discipline and Punish, a revolutionary book that wasn't really about prisons at all. It was about how modern society had learned to shape human behavior through subtle mechanisms of observation, normalization, and control. Foucault showed us that power in the modern world no longer needed to be brutal or spectacular. Instead, it had become invisible, pervasive, and productive. But Foucault died in 1984, never witnessing the internet, smartphones, or social media. He never saw what scholars now call surveillance capitalism, an economic system that commodifies human experience through digital tracking and algorithmic prediction. Today, we'll explore what Foucault would make of our digital age, and why his ideas about power, surveillance, and subjectivity have become more relevant than ever. Foucault's most famous concept, the Panopticon, Jeremy Bentham's prison design, where a central guard tower could observe all inmates without being seen. The genius wasn't in actually watching everyone constantly, but in making prisoners believe they might be watched at any moment. This uncertainty created self-surveillance, prisoners policing their own behavior. Foucault would recognize our smartphones and social media platforms as the perfection of this principle, but with a crucial twist. The original Panopticon relied on the possibility of observation. Our digital Panopticon operates through what Foucault might call seductive surveillance. We participate willingly because observation comes packaged with convenience, entertainment, and connection. Every search, every article, every video is recorded and analyzed. Yet we continue using these platforms because they've become essential. Foucault would call this a forced choice, the illusion of freedom masking fundamental constraint. The power operates not through the crude no of prohibition, but through the enabling yes of facilitation. You feel empowered by personalized services while being systematically subjected to unprecedented monitoring and behavioral modification. Traditional institutions had limited reach. You could leave school, leave work, escape institutional observation. But digital surveillance creates continuous, modulating, and inescapable control. More troubling, this surveillance doesn't just observe existing behaviors, it shapes future ones. You notice your browsing habits change when you're aware they're being tracked. You hesitate before searching certain topics, avoid certain websites, curate your digital footprint for an imagined algorithmic audience. But more subtly, platforms themselves shape what you encounter. The news you see, the people you connect with, the ideas you're exposed to. Foucault analyzed biopower as power over populations. What we're experiencing goes beyond this to what we might call psychopower. The direct shaping of individual consciousness, desire, and choice at the most intimate level. Consider the sophistication. Algorithms don't just predict your behavior, they participate in producing it. If the system predicts you'll be interested in a topic and shows you content about it, the prediction becomes self-fulfilling. The algorithm creates the very preferences it claims merely to observe. Foucault showed how disciplinary institutions create statistical norms that define what's normal and abnormal, healthy and pathological. Algorithmic systems now create new forms of normativity based on data analysis. When Netflix tells you people like you also watched, or LinkedIn suggests people in your network, these aren't neutral observations but normative prescriptions. The algorithm tells you what someone of your type should want, should do, should become. What Foucault would find most sinister. Algorithmic normalization operates through what appears as pure personalization. The system claims to serve your unique individual preferences while actually sorting you into behavioral categories. You're normalized not against some universal standard, but against algorithmic predictions about what people like you typically do. This creates hyper-individualized discipline. Each subject receives customized normalization based on their data profile. The power is more complete because it feels more personal. You experience this as freedom while being subjected to sophisticated behavioral guidance. Foucault showed us that modern institutions don't just control existing subjects, they actively produce new forms of subjectivity, new ways of understanding ourselves, new categories of identity, new modes of relating. Social media platforms don't simply provide neutral spaces for self-expression, they actively participate in producing the selves being expressed. People curate their lives for Instagram, optimize their profiles for LinkedIn algorithms, perform their identities for TikTok's recommendation system. But this isn't just representation, it's production. People genuinely become the selves they perform for these platforms. The influencer represents the purest expression of this new subjectivity, someone whose identity is organized entirely around algorithmic metrics of attention and engagement. Young people develop their sense of who they are through constant feedback from digital platforms. The number of likes, quality of comments, algorithmic reach becomes social validation that shapes self-worth and identity. Unlike traditional socialization through family or community, this feedback is mediated by corporate algorithms designed to maximize engagement rather than human flourishing. Foucault would ask, what kinds of people are we becoming when our sense of self is shaped by systems optimized for data extraction rather than human development? These platforms don't just respond to human preferences, they actively shape them by rewarding certain types of content. The algorithm doesn't care about truth or social welfare, it cares about engagement, time spent on platform, data generation, so it amplifies the most emotionally provocative content, outrage, conflict, extreme positions, simplified narratives. Foucault would recognize this as effective manipulation, the systematic exploitation of emotional responses to maximize user engagement. The algorithm learns to trigger specific emotional states: anger, fear, desire, envy, indignation. Notice the circular logic. Users become trained to perform these emotions because the algorithm rewards them with visibility. The platform claims to give users what they want while simultaneously shaping what they want by amplifying particular forms of emotional expression. This creates polarized subjects, users whose consciousness becomes organized around extreme positions because moderation receives less algorithmic amplification. You become divided against yourself, simultaneously craving the stimulation of outrage while recognizing its toxicity. What we're describing isn't just a side effect. It's the core business model. Companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon have built trillion-dollar enterprises on the extraction and analysis of human behavioral data. Our personal information, attention, and behavioral patterns have become raw materials for profit generation. But this differs fundamentally from traditional capitalist exploitation. In industrial capitalism, workers at least knew they were selling their labor power. In surveillance capitalism, the extraction happens without conscious awareness or meaningful consent. We think we're getting free services, but we're providing free labor, the labor of generating data about ourselves. Foucault would call this pastoral capitalism, a system that exploits subjects through care rather than coercion. Traditional exploitation was relatively transparent, but surveillance capitalism operates through apparent gift exchange. We'll give you free search, free social networking, and in return just use the services. The extraction is invisible. The exploitation feels like benefit. This makes resistance difficult because subjects experience their own exploitation as empowerment. The more data you provide, the better the service becomes, the more personalized your experience. You become invested in your own commodification. Every conversation, every emotion, every moment of attention becomes potential data to be harvested and monetized. What forms of resistance are possible? Many feel simultaneously outraged by these systems and dependent on them. Foucault would argue that resistance must operate at multiple levels simultaneously. Individual consumer choices, voting with your data, are important but insufficient because they accept the basic logic of the system. Regulatory approaches address symptoms but may strengthen the underlying system by making it more sustainable. What Foucault called counterconducts, collective practices that challenge the fundamental logic of power systems, may be more promising. This might involve creating alternative technological arrangements organized around different principles: transparency rather than opacity, user agency rather than behavioral manipulation, collective benefit rather than private profit. Foucault would call for critical subjectivity, the capacity to reflect on how your own thoughts, desires, and behaviors are being shaped by technological systems. This requires not just intellectual understanding, but practical practices of the self, techniques for maintaining autonomous reflection and ethical judgment. Foucault would tell us that power is not simply something that oppresses, it produces. The digital apparatus produces new forms of subjectivity, new pleasures, new possibilities, but also new forms of domination. The task is not to escape power relations entirely, but to transform them in more liberating directions. Surveillance capitalism represents power in its most refined form, operating through freedom rather than constraint, through production rather than prohibition, through seduction rather than coercion. But this also makes it more vulnerable to resistance from subjects who understand its mechanisms and refuse its logic. We are not simply users, consumers, or data subjects. We are human beings capable of ethical reflection, community solidarity, and collective action. The future of digital technology depends on whether we exercise these capacities or allow them to atrophy under algorithmic influence. As Foucault showed us throughout his work, where there is power, there is always the possibility of resistance.